to do. I knew I was good at writing and good at thinking about things, but it didn't occur to me to be a journalist, to be honest. And no one had ever mentioned the profession of journalism. I graduated in 1990, and there was a recession on at the time. It came down to London, worked in a bar, worked in a shop, didn't know what I wanted to do. There wasn't much money around, so I decided to go and travel. So I took a course in teaching English as a foreign language, went to Spain and taught English to Spanish kids. And then my plan was to go around the world. I wanted to go to South America, I wanted to see the world. But I ended up loving Spain, staying there for 3 years, and then approaching 30 and thinking, geez, I need to get a career together. I can't be an expat teaching English all my life. So I came back to the UK, and eventually, after a couple of years, got a place on a postgraduate journalism course at London College of Printing. It was only a 3-month course, but it changed my life. I'd never really tried news writing before, but I found I could do it. It was so easy. It just came really easily to me. And it was a course for mature students who wanted to change of career, and I wanted to find out about journalism. And I got offered a job on Building Design, which was a weekly magazine for architects, off the back of the course. So I went, after the last day of the course, the next day I went in to do this freelance job at Building Design, and that's how my architecture and design writing career started.
Wow. And you say it kind of came easy to you. Was it sort of the storytelling aspect of it, or was it the research that you really kind of enjoyed? What was it about the journalism side of it that kind of you realized it was for you?
Like I said, I just found it easy. I just found that I knew how to present information in story form. I knew how to research. I knew how to write. I just found that I just write a story. Like, they gave us these news exercises. They'd say, read this and tell us what you think the most important bit of information was. And I just knew. I just kind of had an ability to kind of see things from a journalistic point of view, which I'd never tried to do before. So I had no idea that I had that ability. So that was me. Then I became a news journalist for a few years and was a fairly aggressive news journalist. And I still see people now, like you mentioned, Sean Griffis. I remember meeting Sean Griffis when he was at Fashion Architecture Taste, when I was a reporter on Building Design, and probably like harassing him on the phone for some information about something. Yeah. And I saw him a few years ago. I still see him occasionally. And I saw him a few years ago, and he said, "We're all very surprised how you turned out, Marcus, because we thought you were just going to go and write for The Sun or something."
And now you are. I mean, it's funny because Sean, I'm working on a project with Sean at the moment. We're kind of in the process of starting a competition. And he said to me, and I take this as a compliment. You've only met me. I don't know how you're going to take it, but he said to me, he's like, "You remind me of a young Marcus Spears."
Oh yeah, no, I was like, I had really long curly hair, and I was a bit different from everyone else in architecture and design journalism, shall we say. And I'm socially quite shy. I'm not very good at, phoning my mum, that kind of thing. And I'm not very good at small talk, but I found that journalism, I could pick up the phone to a complete stranger and ask them like really direct questions. I could go up to people at an event and ask them really direct questions. And I found I was really good at getting information out of people. Like somehow I was able to make people feel relaxed enough to tell me things that they shouldn't tell me. Which got me into a lot of trouble because I never used any subterfuge or anything to find out information for people, but they would just tell me things. And then, of course, when they saw it in print, they'd often freak out. But it was a skill I didn't know I had until I was almost 30, and it was amazing. Actually, I found that there was a job that I was really, really good at. That I started to win awards. I started to get promoted. People started to talk about me. I liked walking into a room and people going like, "There's that guy from Building Design," or watch out what you say to him. I kind of quite liked being the naughty person in the room in the world of architecture, which was full of really interesting people. I could understand what they were talking about. I got architecture. I got the people, and I found like I'd landed in a world that I could be part of, but also not really being part of, because I think a key thing about being a journalist is you shouldn't be too close to the subject matter. Right. You kind of need to be a little bit aloof in the type of journalism that I think is important, which is reporting and being objective about things.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point. Don't be close to subject matter. The other thing I picked up on is you saying it almost feels like controversy sells, and obviously that's quite maybe an ethos for news anyway. They make their headlines by putting out something controversial. But do you think that is something? Because obviously it could be perceived as a negative thing, but there's also it's part of what journalism is, right?
Well, I don't believe in controversy for the sake of controversy, and I hate being involved in controversy. I feel quite sick if people start calling me out on Twitter. Or I've stopped using Twitter because I hate that. I hate being attacked. I don't want to be attacked. But on the other hand, there are lots of things. There's lots of information out there. Lots of things that are going on that people would rather you didn't talk about, or that appear controversial when they're put in the public arena. Mm. And I think absolutely, as a journalist, you shouldn't shy away from that. You shouldn't. I think it's cowardly to not put something into the public domain because you think it might be controversial or upset people or whatever. There's ways of doing it sensitively. There's ways of doing it to not deliberately upset people or freak them out or whatever. But I think that journalism is a really key pillar of democracy. I mean, it sounds a bit pretentious, but I do think it is. There has to be a way of putting important information into the public domain so that people can then discuss it. It's part of democracy. And if you shy away from that, and it's a very difficult era we live in, because I've lived through the transition from print to internet, and you've seen what's happened in the last few years with the rise of fake news and all these sites that deliberately push, a right-wing agenda or a left-wing agenda or a religious agenda, and it's really hard to find the truth these days. So to me, to run a platform like Dezeen, which is reliable, which is trusted, which is a little bit provocative, but not in the sense of wanting to create division or anything like that, but that is somewhere reliable where people can go to find out what's going on. I mean, that feels like a real good thing to be doing these days.
Yeah, I mean, I completely see what you're saying, because I've known the name Dezeen since I've known anything in architecture. Since my first year in architecture school, Dezeen was always something that came up in our ears and we heard about it. So before you actually started Dezeen, we said that you worked for Icon, but is it true you got fired from Icon?
Yeah.
Was that what happened?
Well, it was the best thing that ever happened, because that was the kick up the arse I needed to launch Dezeen. Well, it was a really stupid story, actually. So after Building Design, the weekly architecture magazine I was telling you about, I then got hired by Building Magazine, another trade magazine, which was more the construction industry, but I was writing about architecture for them. And then I got headhunted to launch Icon, which was a new startup magazine at the time, 2003. And what really appealed to me about Icon was that they wanted to launch a magazine. The publishers wanted to launch a magazine that was based on Blueprints magazine. And Blueprint magazine was the magazine that had turned me on to contemporary architecture and design in the first place. I discovered a copy of Blueprint magazine in the art school library when I was at school, secondary school, and saw, people like Ron Arad and Tom Dixon and Richard Rogers and Nigel Coates and all of those that generation of mostly British, to be honest, architects and designers, and thought, wow, I didn't know about this kind of stuff. This is great. And that probably sowed the seed in my mind that made me go to art school, and that made me then pursue design rather than art or music or any other kind of creative field. So when they said to me, we want this magazine called Icon to capture the spirit of Blueprint magazine. I knew exactly what they meant. It's like there was always a face on the front cover, like an interview with a leading designer. There was the content was fairly provocative. It made you think about stuff. It was sort of international, and it sounded like a great job. And it was an Icon. We launched it in 2003, which in hindsight was, probably about the last time you could launch a magazine without being aware of the internet, because the internet started to become a force for sharing of architecture and design information whilst I was at Icon. Of course, the internet had been around for a long time before that, but nobody really took it seriously as a platform for discussing architecture and design. And so whilst I was at Icon and, not getting on particularly well with my bosses.
Why? What was it up for?
Oh, it's
the controversy thing.
Well, no, not really, but I'm not very good at working for other people. I always knew that I wanted to do my own thing. And my plan, even before I joined the Icon team, was to do my own magazine. And I thought I wanted to be a travel writer. I had a concept for a travel magazine. I had the name. I had bought the website, the domain name. I even sketched out the content for the first issue. I had it all planned out. I just didn't have the funds to get it off the ground. And then I joined Icon, and that was really relatively successful. And then I got commissioned to write a book. Carlton Books approached me and asked me to write a book about 21st century design, which I took on that project. So the reason I got fired was ostensibly because I'd done this book. They weren't happy that I'd done this book because when I took on the book contract, I didn't have a contract that said I couldn't do any freelance projects or whatever. And then I think the day after I handed over the manuscripts, a contract landed on my desk saying, you're not allowed to do any work for third-party publishers without written permission from your bosses. And I was a bit like, oh God, what am I going to do now if I ask them for permission and they say I can't do the book? I'm really stuck because I've written the book. Yeah. Anyway, so I thought I'll just keep it quiet until the book's published, and then I'll just show them the book as a fait accompli and hope for the best. And I showed them the book as a fait accompli, and they freaked out and suspended me on the spot, and then fired me for not for writing the book. Actually, they couldn't. I hadn't done anything wrong in writing a book. I'd done all of the work on the book in my own free time, and I hadn't used company property or my email address or anything like that. But what I had done was I'd agreed to chair a conference in Stockholm, and I was getting paid for it. And I hadn't told my bosses I was getting paid for it, so they went through all my emails and found this one misdemeanor, and that's why I got fired. But actually, it was really quite exciting because in towards the end of my time at Icon, I was there for 3.5 years. Towards the end of my time at Icon, I discovered blogging, or had been introduced to blogging at the Venice Architecture Biennale. Actually, the Architecture Foundation had set up a blogging room at the Biennale, and they invited people to come in and contribute to it. So I remember one day Norman Foster coming into this room, and there were other journalists and other architects coming in and typing away. And for me as a journalist who'd been used to the idea that journalism, weekly magazine journalism or monthly magazine journalism, was quite slow. I mean, on a weekly, of course, it takes a week for your stuff to get out. On a monthly, it takes a month. The idea that you could publish something instantaneously was amazing. And I got really obsessed with this blogging project, and I was like rushing around Venice, filming things on my digital camera, recording audio, uploading it.
And what phone did you have?
Well, I didn't even have a phone. It was kind of I had a mobile phone, but you couldn't do anything on it. So I had a standalone digital camera and was taking movie clips on that. I think it was a Minolta or something like that, one of the early digital cameras. And of course, the image quality was pretty ropey. Yeah. But I thought this is amazing. This is so fast, and I became the most prolific contributor to this blog. And then shortly after that, I got suspended and then fired. And so in my head, I was like thinking, well, look, I can, instead of doing a print magazine, which I'm going to need a lot of money to start up, and I'm going to need salespeople, and I'm going to need a printer, and I'm going to need a paper supplier and a distributor, I could start a blog. So I bought the domain name Dezeen.com, which I thought everyone would understand. It was a kind of contraction of Design magazine, but people still don't get that. Set up my blog. Didn't really tell anyone about it, but I sent one email to this Japanese guy, Eizo Akado, who ran a site called Design, Dezain.net, which was like an aggregator site. And he was really the only person doing interesting stuff on the internet in the architecture and design space at that time. And he would just every morning trawl all the other sites and put up links to interesting projects on other architecture and design sites or news sites or whatever. So I emailed him and said, by the way, I've left Icon magazine. I've set up my own blog here. And he would often post my stories and often say to me, oh, that was great. Can you do more things like that? So he guided me in the early days. And then Dezeen just took off on its own. I mean, people found it through search, people found it through this design.net site. And I was, running a blog that people started to visit and started to comment on. And then shortly after that, a few weeks after that, it was the early days of the Design Miami collectible design fair in Miami. And so I thought, I'll go there. I'll go to Miami. I'll be able to do some reportage. I'll meet some people. I filled up my suitcases with copies of my book. I went out there, didn't really know anyone. It was a disaster to start with. I lost my passport at the airport. I arrived at this awful hotel, the cheapest hotel I could find, and couldn't find my passport. So they wouldn't even let me check in properly, but they let me stay in the room, and I spent half the time dealing with the passport situation. And then finally made it to the fair and introduced myself to Ambra Mehta, who was the co-director of the fair, and gave her a copy of my book, the book that had got me fired. And she sort of took me under her wing and invited me to some parties, and invited me to a party that was at the house of Craig Robbins, who is the owner of the Design Miami Fair. It was a garden party, really glamorous with palm trees and waterfront and everything like that. And Kanye West was there. And so I went up to Kanye West and said, what are you doing here, man? And
did you give him the book?
I didn't have any books with me at the party, to be honest. But he was really nice, and he told me about his, love of how he collected Martin Bass and the Campana brothers. And
he actually spoke to him?
Yeah, I was hanging out with him and his crew, and not for ages, but like 15 minutes or something like that. And he told me that he'd got Claudio Silvestrin, this London minimalist architect, to do his next New York apartment, and I asked him if I could publish it on my design blog, and he introduced me to his publicist and said, you need to speak to her about that. And then I sort of emailed her a few times, and she sent me through these really low-res renderings of Kanye's crib, and I published them in January 2004, so about, 6 weeks after I launched the site. And that was my first viral story. Like suddenly thousands of people were piling onto my site to see pictures of Kanye's apartment.
That's crazy. It's like sometimes it is just that one story, that one thing that really propels.
That definitely gave the site a big push. Yeah, that definitely got a lot of attention.
Because Kanye, I only recently realized how much Kanye was into architecture and design, with all the recent projects he's been kind of talking about. And I think he even talked about starting his own practice. But this is 2004 and he was still in these circles.
2006.
And he was still in these circles.
I might have got my years a bit mixed up there. So Dezeen was launched in 2006. It would have been 2007 when I put the story up. Right. Yeah, early the next year. Yeah.
And so you started this kind of Dezeen journey. It's taken off. Kanye blog is getting so many views. But you talked about this thing once where you said it was 1 hour a day you would spend on Dezeen. Is that during your time while you were working at Icon, or is this kind of, because how are you managing? I suppose you kind of went full time at this point.
No. So I didn't launch Dezeen until after I'd been fired from Icon.
Yeah.
I think I set it up about 10 days after I got my email saying, "You're fired." I didn't know anything about how to set up. We use WordPress. I didn't know anything about WordPress, so I went around to a friend's house who we spent about an hour and a half setting it up together, choosing the fonts and everything. And I remember thinking of it. I remember feeling really sort of attached to my blog and really obsessing over it. But we had 2 young children at the time, so obviously I had to earn a living. So I was freelancing and I was sort of half-heartedly applying for jobs, but not really. I wanted to build Dezeen into a brand. I really thought that it could become a global brand. I don't know, it was kind of a bit of a naive and irrational belief at the time. It turned out to become true, of course. But I really did think it could achieve something. But I had to discipline myself because I would happily have spent all of my waking hours working on this blog. So I did say to myself, look, if I spend an hour a day on it, then I can do other freelance stuff and I can, pay the bills, so on and so forth. And so that's how it worked for quite a few months, actually. I remember going on holiday to the Lake District and having to leave we were staying on an estate with sort of Scandinavian style lodges, and in those days there was no internet in most buildings. So each morning I'd walk to the lobby of the hotel nearby where they had Wi-Fi and spend a bit of time putting a story up, moderating the comments, and then go back, close my laptop for the rest of the day. And I also remember in that first summer, we were in a very remote village in Tuscany, and having to drive half an hour to the nearest internet cafe. And, I'd do that like every other day. I thought I can do it. I can have a day off in between if I'm on holiday. And where there was like one computer in this, it was a normal cafe, but it had one computer that you could log on to the internet on, and going and spending like a couple of hours checking my email and uploading a story, and again dealing with all the comments and everything like that, and then logging off and driving back to the family in the hilltop village.
Dedication.
Yeah, but I loved it. It was kind of it was really fun and really felt like exciting and like kind of pioneering. Of course, the blogs have been around for years before Dezeen started, but it felt like I was entering a new world. And as a journalist, because I'd been working as a journalist for, I don't know, like 7 years or something like that, 7 or 8 years. But there were things about the internet that I thought were really profound and powerful, like linking, for example, that you can't, it sounds obvious now, but you can't link from text written on paper. But that journey that the reader goes on, that they can click through from your story to something else, or from your story to another story on the same site. And then, so that was one, that the ability of links to transform the experience of reading text. And then the other was the comments. WordPress comes with a built-in comments system. And of course, on the magazines I'd worked on before, readers would, in the early days, send in letters to the editor, or later on send emails in. We wouldn't get many of them, and they were usually kind of people ranting on about stuff, and a lot of magazines. We never did it on Icon. I promise we never did it on Icon. But a lot of magazines would write the letters page themselves because they simply didn't get enough real letters. Wow. So I'd log on in the morning to Dezeen and check the comments, and there'd be all these comments from people, all these people saying stuff, like getting involved in the conversation, which was amazing. I mean, a lot of them were saying like kind of horrible stuff, abusive stuff, yeah. But a lot of them were giving genuinely interesting insights or asking questions or whatever. So those were the two things that for me were, well, three things really. So first of all, the speed with which you could publish on the internet compared to print was just transformational. And the fact that everyone could find it no matter where in the world they were. They didn't have to walk to a newsagent. They didn't have to order, a publication that didn't necessarily come to their town. And then the fact that the notion of the hyperlink was just really profound. And then the culture of people commenting. So it became like instead of journalism being a one-way conversation, the media telling the readers what's important, there was a kind of constant feedback loop of readers adding their own knowledge, having a go at you, being abusive, which became a problem actually until we figured out how to weed out the abusive stuff. But that was really, again, that's a kind of, there were quite a few profound things that made me realize that the internet was a kind of really fruitful platform to be on, and I've never looked back.
What kind of abuse were you getting?
Well, you know what it is with comments. It's the same as when somebody walking down the street will be polite, and as soon as they get in a car, they suddenly become an arsehole. Yeah. Not always, but often, because the radio's on. There's glass and metal protecting you from everyone else. And suddenly you're the most important person in the world, and fuck that person on the zebra crossing, fuck that cyclist. Online it's kind of similar, but it's worse actually, because often people have they're anonymous on the internet, so they think they can behave however they want. So commenters did quite often say very rude things about the designer or the project, which then started to quite upset designers. I remember taking calls from some friends whose projects had been ripped apart by these kind of.
But that's not your fault. I mean, you've put their work out there. I mean, that's the kind of democracy thing we're talking about. Their work is out there. People are giving honest feedback. Why is that a bad thing?
Well, yeah, you could say that, but it was honest and maybe it wasn't honest. But the thing is, it was anonymous and it was brutal, and people have feelings. And
it was more trolling than.
Yeah, it was trolling. Yeah. And there are still a couple of designers who don't send me projects anymore because they got their fingers burnt like 13 years ago. Yeah. So actually controlling, one of the big challenges has been to find a way to moderate and control that comment community, because people will behave outrageously online if they're given half the chance. But actually we have a very healthy comment community now. So we have more comments than ever before because we're strict about the rules. It's like we don't tolerate any abuse, we don't tolerate any sexism or racism or bigotry or just misbehavior. And actually we have an astonishing amount of discussion internally about comments all the time. So we have a team. The moderation duty is shared between different members of the team, but if they're not sure about a comment, they'll email around, and I'm often about to get on a plane, and someone will say, "Is this okay?" And I'll be like, "No, it's not okay," or the first part's okay, but that last sentence is really dodgy. But I think a way of thinking about it is that it's like if you want kids to play safely in the playground, you build a little playground for the kids, and you say, no name calling, no stone throwing, no smoking. You set some rules for the playground, okay? And then the kids will come, they'll enjoy the sandpit, and they'll enjoy the slide, and everyone will be happy. But if you don't set those rules, then suddenly bigger kids will come along, bullies will come along, and it will turn into the nice kids won't come anymore, and it will just become inhabited by gangs or whatever. It's the same with the comments. As soon as we took out the nasty people, then lots of people who had kind of intelligent and more sensitive and more calmer things to say then started to comment.
And you value the comments quite a lot.
Oh, it's a massive part of Dezeen's identity, yeah. Yeah, massive part of our identity. And we really, really have worked very, very hard to create a space where people can feel comfortable commenting, where they're not going to get trolled or flamed by other people.
You know, I'm curious because I was talking to Sean about this as well, and it was this how the internet coming about really propelled certain things, especially in this kind of media, for the exact reasons you're talking about. You know, the ease of the speed and everything. You know, how you could get content out to people, so many people. But I'm curious, were you guys way ahead of the curve at this point, or did you have any sort of staunch competitors at the time?
Well, one of the reasons why I thought it might be a smart idea for me to launch an architecture and design blog, because it was a blog, it is a blog. The software that Dezeen runs on is WordPress, which is blogging software. But I never called it a blog. I always called it a magazine, because blogging at that time had a bit of a reputation for being people who sort of ranting on about stuff. So I felt like calling it a magazine was more civilized and more grown up. But the reason why I got very excited about launching Dezeen was I thought, as I said before, I thought I could create something that would be global and that would be successful and that would be a brand and that could potentially be a future career for me. Partly because not many other people were doing it. There were architecture and design websites, and Design Boom was around already then and been going for a few years. There was a site called Reluct, which was pretty good. There were Moco Loco was up and running by then. But to be honest, not to diss those publications, you could tell they weren't written by people who had journalistic training. Right. And I knew how to write. I knew, like I said, I was this lucky ability to write stories that people would read and respond to. So I think that I was able to bring a kind of journalistic nous to architecture and design blogging that possibly hadn't been there before. And I think the other thing was, and I've only just realized that I was good at this from early on, was, which sounds really geeky to talk about, but taxonomy. Like when you have a print like a newspaper or a magazine, the structure is really obvious. You have a front cover, you have a back cover, and then you have pages 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, whatever. And then somewhere near the front, you need an index. That's it. It's really simple. If you do a book, similar, but you divide it up into chapters. And magazines might have sections. So they've got the news section at the beginning, and then there's a feature section and opinion section. Like that kind of structure was laid down years and years ago. So you could pretty easily start a new magazine, and the structure was, you just copy the structure of your favorite magazine. But on the internet, people consume information in different ways. So actually, in the early days of Dezeen, a lot of people would go onto the homepage and then scroll down and click. But actually, most people now don't do that. They come in from social media and stuff like that. But not many people go through a website in the same way they'll go through a magazine or a book. So therefore, the way that you structure the information and the way you link all of the information together needs thinking about. And fortunately, Dezeen, we struck on a very kind of clear and logical taxonomy very early on, almost by accident, which meant that it was very easy for people to find what they were looking for on the site. And that was one of the things people would always say to me in the early days, like, oh, I love Dezeen. It's so easy to find what I'm looking for. And then also that structure was very, very search engine friendly. So it meant that people could find Dezeen's information through search really easily. So those two things really helped the success of Dezeen. The kind of quality of the articles in the first place, although admittedly in the early days, because I didn't have much time, they were pretty skeletal. The information was pretty basic. But it was structured in a smart way that made it easier for people to navigate it and easier for people to find it. And that's one of the reasons it survived. And I didn't know about that at the time, but in hindsight, we got that right early on.
You've met some legendary designers, artists, architects, and outright polymaths over the years, but I want you to guess which person said this. The whole nature of what design is has kind of atomized, really. It no longer describes one thing. Rather, it acts as an approach or an attitude to doing whatever you think is the right thing to do.
Don't know. Is that something someone said to me?
Well, what do you think of that quote?
Don't know. What's the? I don't understand what the question is.
You said that.
Did I? Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think I loved that quote because
Trick question.
Yeah, trick question. Because you're talking about this kind of, how design is such a multidisciplinary thing. It's such a vastly, broad term. And I think it's testament to how kind of ahead of the curve you were. Because this was from an interview 10 years ago.
Oh, was it?
Yeah. So I obviously don't expect you to remember it, but kind of just wanted to bring it up to show how wise it is to me, because right now I've started a brand, a design brand, whatever, and I'm still having to try and get this message out of how design is, less of a, specific thing to do with object and material and art, whatever, but it's more of how you approach a certain task or solution. I think there is a bit of a crisis going on in architecture. And I think a lot of it is down to this very thing, which is architects, designers don't necessarily engage in design as a holistic practice. And what they think architecture is very, very confined to, certain things. Dezeen is kind of the vision of how I think architecture should be, which is, it's not just buildings. What do you think about that?
Well, I think it's important to say that even though I studied design and then wrote about architecture for a number of years, I now don't consider myself to be in the architecture and design space. I'm in the information space. The Dezeen as a brand is about disseminating, sharing information, providing services to a community, an international community that is interested in or works in architecture and design. But my obsessions are not architecture and design. My obsessions are information and taxonomies and coming up with new ways of presenting information and coming up with new services. So I guess I'm sort of distancing myself from that kind of architecture clique in a way, because it's not what particularly interests me. I'll happily pursue a topic for Dezeen or encourage the editorial team to pursue a topic like architecture education, because I can see that it's important to the community. But I'm not.
You don't see yourself part of the architecture community?
No, and I don't. I don't. It's not. What am I trying to say here? It's like I'm interested in it for its informational value and its ability to connect with our audience, and then as a topic for people to discuss, and then something that we can do an interview about, or something at a conference or whatever, rather than it being my livelihood, because I'm not from that community. I'm not invested in architecture and design as a professional. And I guess that goes back in a way to what I was saying before about thinking it's important to not get too close to the people and the subject matter. I didn't become an architecture and design journalist because I thought that architecture and design was the most important thing in the world. I became an architecture and design journalist because I understood it and I was able to write about it. But I think that distance I have has been really fortunate for me. I think people can become too into the subject.
I see what you mean, but I suppose you still must have a position when it comes to certain, I guess, design stuff, design principles. Because I remember also that there was a certain question that was asked to you about social change, and you seemed a bit skeptical about how designers have the ability to create social change, and do you still feel the same today in terms of, do you think designers and design itself has immense power to influence social change?
I think architecture and design has some power to do that, But what's more interesting to me is, as a publication, as a magazine, or as a media platform, or whatever you want to call Dezeen, how can we ask a question or set up a debate that allows people to speculate on that, or that allows people to put forward their opinions of it, that allows us to change the way people think about it? And the most important thing for me and for Dezeen is to set the agenda. That's what we want to be known for. We want people to say, did you see that thing on Dezeen? Or I read on Dezeen that da-da-da, what do you think? We want to be not just slavishly reporting on what the architecture and design world is doing, but speaking at the same level as those kind of characters and helping push the debate forward in whatever direction, hopefully in a progressive direction, because we're all sort of slightly lefty here, and we all believe in, like in a fairer society and in certain set of values. But it's the particular thing you're talking about is like, do designers have the power to influence the world or society or whatever? I mean, that's a kind of provocation in a way, because a few years ago we were looking around, and there was a lot of stories about the refugee crisis, and of course the environmental crisis, and the pollution crisis, and the whatever, all these crises, and nothing seems to be done about them. So as Architecture and Design magazine, it seemed like a kind of intelligent question to say, well, look, if the politicians aren't able to do anything about climate change, and the corporations are playing lip service to climate change, but really still carrying on the same, and so on, could design do something about it? But to be honest, that's not because we thought that design could do something about it, but it felt like an interesting question to ask, to see where that discussion would take us. And actually it became really hot topic. We did this series of talks at Such Design Week called Good Design for a Bad World. But it was very much a media project. We thought about the name, Good Design for a Bad World. We thought about the identity of it. We thought about the way that we would have this conversation. So I guess what I'm trying to say in a roundabout kind of way is that I think that journalism is just as important as architecture and design, and that's my job. My job is to be a journalist. My job is to run a media platform that represents the architecture and design community, that challenges and provokes the architecture and design community, and entertains the architecture and design community. But I'm not the architecture and design community. I'm something else. I'm a media person.
If there was a pie chart for Dezeen's kind of, let's say, focus, how much of that pie chart would be taken up by architecture? Because you've also got product design, you've got fashion, you've got all these big sort of fields. How much of that is architecture, would you say?
Architecture is by far the most popular thing we write about. I mean, again, we're sort of back to taxonomy in a way, but we write about three key topics: architecture, interior design, and then everything else design. So everything else design is everything from tableware to automotive design, infrastructure, furniture, lighting, whatever. Architecture is the most popular, gets the most visits by far, followed by interiors, interestingly, because interiors are sort of the hardcore architecture crew think that the interior design is a bit wet, but it's massively popular. And then third is design. And then we write about a few other topics on the side. So technology, there's a lot of crossover between technology and architecture and design. A bit of art, but not so much. And a bit of fashion, although we tend to lump fashion in with design, because we tend to only write about fashion when it's got a sort of designiness to it, if you know what I mean. We're not interested in trends or sort of what's in this year.
Yeah.
That kind of thing.
I'm also interested in how important students are to Dezeen, because in particular architecture students. How important would you say they are to Dezeen's operation? Because in terms of the stories you cover, I think you say architecture is quite a big chunk of what you cover because it's the most popular. But me personally, I'm heavily involved in the architecture student community, and there's a lot of outstanding drawing work and competitions and all these sort of amazing student initiatives going on. How much of that do you think, is that quite an important aspect of Dezeen as well?
To be honest, it's probably fair to say it's slightly a neglected aspect. It's there's so much going on in the world, and we love it when we discover a new talent and help them become successful. But to be honest, when our playground is the entire world. So like, do we cover enough student work? No. Do we cover enough work from India? No. India's our third biggest audience, and we write about it like once a month or something like that. So we're constantly having these discussions like, how do we represent our audience more fairly? I think you have to pick your battles. Like, so we make decisions about what we're going to make a stand on and what we're going to try and make a difference on, and there's limits of what you can do. So a couple of years ago, it was gender equality. We noticed that, in fact, it was before the Me Too thing exploded, we noticed that hardly any women had won the big awards. Hardly any women had positions of power in big companies. Hardly any women were on the stage at conferences. And we thought, like, we can make a difference here. We chose to pursue that as an agenda. Same with the architecture and design for social change. Same for Brexit. We did a lot of work around Brexit. You mentioned design in Hackney early on. That was around the time of the 2012 London Olympics when Hackney, which is where I live and where Dezeen's office is, was tarred with the brush of being a crime-infested, poor, run-down borough. And we thought, no, we're going to celebrate our borough because there are loads of great creative people here. So we did a project whereby we promoted talent in the borough and did a map and did a conference with Hackney Council about it. Of course, ironically, not long after that, Hackney became so gentrified that most of the creatives had to move out. So I suppose we had some small bit of blame for that.
Is it scary how influential a story in Dezeen can be?
No, it's not scary. It's great. Really? Yeah, it's really great.
Because like you said about the student, it takes one article to propel someone's career into success.
No, that, like I said, that is our key benchmark of success, to be influential, to make people see things in a different way, for people to discover new talent through our platform, to learn things they didn't know about. When just before you turned on the recorder, I was saying, like, I might have to keep checking my phone because we're hoping to get a statement from Saloni del Mobile in Milan because they may or may not cancel or postpone the fair. And we want to be the first people that put that out there. We want everyone to be waiting for Dezeen to give them the information that will determine whether they book a flight or pay for a stand or order the batch of new prototypes or whatever.
That's a really interesting point, actually, because it made me think. So how you've probably met a lot of star architects over the years, and I'm really interested in terms of what makes an architect a star architect and how much of a role organizations like Dezeen, a media company, has in perpetuating the perception of an architect so that they become this star.
I think that system was in place long before the internet came along. Yeah, I mean, some people are more interesting than others. I mean, you could spend an hour with Rem Koolhaas, for example, and he's an exhilarating person to talk to, but I think that people rise up to the top and become stars or become media celebrities or whatever for a bunch of reasons, usually because what they're doing is consistently good and they've got interesting things to say. But not always. There are a few people in that kind of star architect bunch that I personally don't rate so much.
Who would you say?
I'm not going to give you any names. But they're not the be all and end all. They're not the kind of they're not the suns around which the whole universe revolves or whatever. But they are popular. I mean, we do often choose to write about things because we know that they'll get traction and gets an audience. That's not the only reason we choose things, but we even still, actually, even 2 or 3 years after Zaha Hadid died, anything from Zaha's office is going to be popular. Anything from OMA, Rem's office, is going to be popular. There are a few people that consistently attract interest.
Because it was about that point that I was kind of linking, and it was, when Zaha Hadid died, it was a, extremely shocking day for us in architecture, because we kind of grew up, learning about her and her journey and her work. And I suppose it's a weird one because it's, I don't know how affected this office was when Zaha Hadid died, but obviously you carry on with you have to carry on with your journalistic duties. And in some ways, that, of all things, is probably one of the most important things to put out, really good or reliable information on. And I remember when we heard about this, we were like, go to Dezeen to check, is this really a thing? So I can see what you're saying about, how you want to be that kind of, that influential platform. But can it get a bit nerve-wracking, doing a story for the sake of the story? And because it can be quite sensitive, don't you think?
Nerve-wracking? No, it's exciting. I mean, it's journalists, often they end up hating themselves because you get excited when newsworthy things happen, even though they're actually tragic. Like when Zaha Hadid died, I was in Venice with my family. We were on a kind of like a Easter holiday in Venice, and I think I saw it on social media or something like that, and we immediately emailing the office about how to handle this. So you then, I suppose it's like a fireman in a way. It's like, fireman, as soon as the siren goes on, you're a fireman and your job is to go and put out the fire. The journalist, like when something happens, your job is to react to what's happened and put the information out there in the best possible way. So, the death of Zaha, it was a really memorable occasion where you feel a great sense of responsibility, actually. And it sounds kind of maybe weird to say that it's exciting, but it is. It's like, oh my God, how are we going to do justice to this event? How much are we going to write? Who are we going to get to comment? What do we do? I remember as I said, I wasn't in the office when it happened, but we did a good job of the story. And then somebody wrote an opinion piece for us who was quite negative about Zaha. And it really didn't go down well with our audience, because people didn't want to hear that Zaha was a diva or whatever just after she died. And we got a backlash about that. So when I got back to the office, I wrote a piece about my personal relationship with Zaha and tried to be as honest as possible about how I saw her. And there were a lot of anecdotes in there which were like how flirtatious she was and how funny she was and how this, that, and the other. And it was actually really successful. But in a way, that was a calculated piece, because I didn't want people to think that Dezeen was a mean publication that would dish the dirt on someone that had just died. It was sort of, let's put something out there that is more warm, and that's a risk, because you never know when that's going to backfire. But it actually was really successful, and we got a lot of kudos for that, for getting the tone right. Often with journalism, it's not just about getting the information out there; it's about getting the tone right. And there's been a few other examples of that as well, when we've got really angry about something and it's gone down really well, or we've got really poignant about things. And so, like when Notre Dame burnt down, for example, that was huge. It's horrible and it's sad, but it's a news story, so you just got to put it out there. But there are ways of doing that take the audience with you, and there are ways of doing that alienate you from the audience. And a successful publication is one that takes its audience with it as much, 90% of the time, including into areas that are unknown or potentially dangerous, like raising the question of, can design save the world, for example. It's quite easy for that to be a very pretentious story, or a very icky story, or a very, I don't know, like like a so what kind of story, but to do it in a way that's got a bit of mischief in it and a bit of fun in it and a bit of seriousness, and to take people with you and make them kind of buy into that whole thing. Same with like gender equality. It's very easy to do stories like that and it to be really worthy and boring, but to do it with a bit of spark and a bit of provocation and a little bit of finger wagging, but not too much. It's kind of, that's really fun actually to think about. It's the kind of seasoning in the soup in a way, or the, you know, the presentation and the tone. Like I said, tone is really important. And people don't realize that actually. People just think you're just churning out words. Like, no, actually it's considered. We have protocols for how we say things, and we test things a lot, and we change things a lot, and we have a lot of discussions to try and get it right.
There's a whole new economy booming now with, you know, things related to climate change activism and sustainable technology solutions. I'm just curious what you think from being in your perspective. You know, how much is real ground being covered in the climate change cause?
Well, I think, again, our approach is to, well, we publish, I don't know, 15, 18 stories a day, and most of them are about projects. So most of them is like, here's a new house with a cantilevered, you know, garage, or here's a holiday home in Spain or whatever. But we try to intelligently publish clusters of content that have some kind of direction to them. So we choose it, and that's what is most powerful when you choose topics. So in terms of sustainability and climate change and things like that, the first one we talked about was the old notion of the Anthropocene, the notion that humans are changing the geological structure of the earth. And at the time, nobody knew what that was. So we put out a series of stories that helped people to understand what that meant. And then last year, we did a lot of work about the circular economy. We started to hear about the circular economy, and we couldn't find anywhere in the architecture and design sense that where it had been written about that made any sense. It was just being used as a buzzword. So we broke it down. We did an interview with Ellen MacArthur. We did a whole series of stories about it. So now, if you're looking for good information on what the circular economy is and how to achieve that through architecture and design, Dezeen has a really good tag of circular economy stories. We've started to do that now with timber architecture, you know, how and increasingly also zero carbon or carbon negative construction. Yeah. So you start these themes, you make sure that it's clear that this is a story about zero carbon architecture. You do some interviews, do some project stories. So you build in a kind of body of information that is intelligent, that is well structured, and that's easy to find through search. So it's a sort of ongoing mission to kind of break down these bigger topics into useful packages of information, if you know what I mean. And then within the news thing, so it's like Extinction Rebellion, yes, we did some stories about them and so on and so forth, but what we want to do is like not just jump on the bandwagon and write about Extinction Rebellion every week, but to sort of draw out of movements things that require explaining, things that require breaking down, and things that require demystifying. And that's what I think Dezeen is really, really good at. So for example, you know, buzzwords like biodegradable or zero carbon, for example, whatever. Like, we don't allow our writers to just drop those into stories willy-nilly, because it's very easy, because it's in the press release or whatever. So we come up with definitions for them internally, and we make sure that the writer uses the definition in the story, links to a tag or whatever where there are more stories about that. So we kind of, you know what I mean? We pick off topics and try and define them, and try and make sure that not through one story, but through a collection of different stories, you've kind of nailed that particular thing.
I said Adam Nathaniel Furman had a lot of questions. An interesting one, he goes, I wonder what he feels about supporting people of different backgrounds, from whom very non-standard aesthetics are important as part of their identity, given that Dezeen and other mainstream publications are sometimes criticized for promoting very normalizing aesthetic.
Well, thanks, Adam. Thanks for that one. No, I kind of know where he's coming from. We do try to be as broad a church as possible. I mean, I think there is a sort of definite look to the kind of projects Dezeen favours, are often quite minimalistic and plain and so on and so forth. But at the same time, I think that taste is changing. I mean, this kind of maximalism thing is quite a big thing at the moment. There's been an explosion of colour in design. So we definitely like to think of ourselves as kind of experimental in terms of the type of projects that we cover. But you can't do everything. That's absolutely clear. There's no way you can cover everything with a team of the size that we've got. So sometimes you have to choose your battles, like I was saying before.
Well, to go from one difficult question to another, this one's from Sean Griffis, from co-founder of FAT. He said...
it's becoming like a phone-in now.
Yeah. He's like, I also asked how he thinks the international design scene, with its conferences and biennales and people flying around the world to attend them, fits with an agenda that's meant to be addressing climate change.
Yeah, well, the thing is, the world is as it is, right? We're here. We have this kind of culture and this society and this materialism and this this structure of the world, and we all want it to be different, but we have to deal in the real world. All of these things crop up for reasons like conferences and design weeks, and they've become part of the industry that we're in, and you can start to sort of break it down and critique that. But to not be part of it is really hard, actually. It's really hard. I mean, the flying thing, I feel guilty now when I fly, but also flying generates 3% of carbon emissions.
Yeah.
I mean, as an individual, what are you supposed to do? So the way I always rationalize this to myself is that I have a power, Dezeen has a power, we have a power to put a positive agenda out there and try and influence the architecture and design sector, and then through that, possibly that sector can then influence the world. So by talking about things like gender equality in architecture, by talking about things like promoting zero carbon or carbon negative buildings, or helping designers learn what's the difference between plastic that biodegrades in a harmless way to one that biodegrades in a harmful way, or explaining what the circular economy is. We hope that through all of those kind of topics, we can help guide people in a more positive way. But we're certainly not advocating that people suddenly become hermits and stay at home with the heating off. I mean, it just doesn't make any sense. I think it's a really easy criticism to make. Oh, you're getting on a plane and polluting the atmosphere and going to a conference and yada, yada, yada. When the whole of the kind of interconnected global society we live in is all bad for the planet. And it's the mere fact that we're here wearing clothes and consuming food and talking into several £1,000s worth of equipment that's got rare minerals in them and plastic, and it's all bad, isn't it? It's like, what's going to happen to all these cameras when they've reached the end of their life? What's going to happen to your shirt when it reaches the end of its life? I mean, I think you can disappear down a rabbit hole. You're not too.
I see what you mean. Here's the last one, and it's by Arthur Mamimani. So again, he was part of the design day, wasn't he?
Yeah.
He says, it's a nice question. He goes, if Dezeen were to publish a manifesto for design it believes in, what would it be, and which ism would it use? Because I remember you mentioned this notion of Designism.
Yeah.
And actually I was very excited here coming today to talk about, and I think we did, thankfully talk about it in some ways, this kind of multidisciplinary thing. And for me, architecture was, I think we're starting to understand through all the guests I've spoken to that architecture is more than just material and building. And that's why companies like Dezeen are I truly believe in this vision. And I don't know whether you know it or not, but behind the curtains, Dezeen has done huge things for architecture to be seen as a multidisciplinary thing. And I love the fact that you guys put out those stories of multidisciplinary designers who have architectural backgrounds. Chris Hildry is someone we just had on the podcast as well, and he's a great example of that. So Designism, when you mentioned that, I was super excited about. But yeah, Arthur's question is, if you had a manifesto for building, for design that you believe in, what would it be, and which ism would you use?
Well, I'm gonna sidestep your question a bit, and first of all explain what the kind of Designism thing was, because it was actually kind of slightly designed to puncture the self-righteousness of architecture and design, because the notion of Designism is like, if you're in design, you think design is the most important thing.
Yeah.
But if you're in financial services, you think that financial services is the most important thing. If you're in marine biology, you think that marine... It's like you're kind of people that get excited that the thing that they're doing is the thing that's going to make all the difference. And I think it's quite nice to play with that kind of thing. So I would say, you could say that journalism is the most important thing. The most important thing is journalism, and politicians say that politicians are, or whatever. So that the Designism was a kind of provocation. Right. But at the same time, architecture and design is the world in which Dezeen sits. So if we were to have any kind of manifesto, it would be about how, as a media platform, we can provoke, cajole, charm, flatter, and influence the architecture and design community to be more influential and productive and better paid and happier and more equal and all of those kind of things. So that's we don't have what was the word you used? We don't have a manifesto for the architecture and design world. We don't want to play that role. We want to be like a platform in which those kind of things rise to the surface and are discussed, but we don't want to. We aren't, like I said, I'm not of architecture and design.